Welcome to yet another edition of Awful Talk with Ben, joined once again by a very special guest. I don't know how I've managed to get so lucky to start off the 2024 season. Back-to-back guests. This week we've got our reigning champion, and if you're down with the wrestling, you got to hold your ones up because he is our current champion. That's Ryan. There you go. Welcome, Ryan.
Hello. Hello. I'm glad to be here. Glad to grace you with my wonderful presence, my
All right,
championship
now
presence.
now we've gone too far. Um, I guess I feel like I'm just gonna lean into it now. I'm gonna let you have your fun for at least a few months before I get really tired of it. So uh, for
Well,
now, I'm on board.
I have until the end of this coming season, because I will be the reigning champion until somebody takes it away from me. So
Yeah,
I
I
have
know there's technically, yeah, you get like a calendar
almost
year to enjoy it, but
almost a
I'm
full year yet.
I'm just telling you, I don't think it's gonna last that long for me. I don't think.
We'll see.
But
We'll see.
uh, yeah, we'll see. It feels very apropos to have you on here because I wanted to take some time to talk about what it takes to build a winning team in this league.
Well, we're
And I
the
guess,
only two that know how to do it so far.
see, there is that. I was a two-time repeat champ, joined by current champ. Uh,
Yeah.
I do know, full transparency, a lot of this is going to be conjecture because we are expanding. So I'm sure, things are going to be a little bit different. It's going to not be a one-to-one strategy going into a new year, but
Correct.
there's
Correct.
going to be some luck, right? Like it takes more than a little bit of luck to find Puka Nakua or Sam Laporta or Montez Sweat or gosh, any of those guys. So
Kyron
um,
Williams was my find of this last year. That was the one that kind of put me there
Kyron
last year.
Williams,
So
yeah.
yeah, it takes some luck. It takes that reading kind of the lay of the land, who needs what, who possibly could be going after what, how much of those fab dollars that you talked about in your last video do you throw at a person? Probably not your entire fortune at somebody that didn't have a team, um, but to each their own.
We're never gonna let that die. I hope. Anyway, um, there are some hacks. I feel like when we want to talk specifically about roster construction, and so that's kind of what I wanted to focus on tonight. Um, let's start from square one. I've got hopefully the spreadsheet is quasi legible for folks watching this later on. What I did was I divided up a chunk of last year's teams. So here on this spreadsheet, we've got two teams that were in the playoffs, two teams that missed the playoffs, and I looked at a 4 week span of the season for each of those teams. On one page, I've got offense. On another page, I've got defense. So I wanted to see if we could find any sort of trends, any sort of angles that we could work to kind of get a leg up uh, building the team heading into the season. Um,
Sure.
points right off the bat. Um, the top four teams that made the playoffs per game, uh, 225.6 points, 220.1, 209, 205.8. So a good rule of thumb, if you want to make the playoffs, you have to average at least 205 points per game. Um, we did have a team that missed the playoffs that averaged 217. There was a lot of bad luck for that player. I'm not going to name names, but
We don't need to go too deep
he's
into who that might be.
he's certainly not bitter about it. Um, so expanding the league, shrinking rosters down a little bit. I think it's safe to say if we took off about 15 points per team, we'd probably come to about the same spot. So, uh, if I were a betting man, I would say that if you wanted to make the playoffs, you'll be looking to put up at least, uh, oh gosh. So if we went from 205, shrunk it down 15, 190.
Yeah.
So 190 per game probably puts you solidly in the playoff hunt. We are expanding playoffs too, so that's something to keep in mind as well. But
Right.
we're going to say just now, aim for 190. Okay, so how can we get to 190? Well, uh, actually, before I get even that far down the road, um, top 10 players. Top 10 players was something I dug into a little bit. Um, I found that all of our playoff teams had at least 7 top 10 players at any kind of given position um, on their team as kind of like cornerstones, which,
Sure.
makes sense. You need a lot of players that are going to put up a lot of points. I don't know if it's necessarily a hard or fast number. Looking at teams that were outside of the playoffs, I think everybody seemed to have at least like 5 or 6, but the differentiators seem to be those few guys that had 8, 9 players. They all made it. So uh, I guess another thing to mention, ESPN does kind of divide out some of those positional groups. So like DT is counted as its own positional group.
Right.
Cornerback and safety are counted as their own. Obviously, DT and cornerback, if you have a number 3 guy at one of those positions, not as valuable as like a number 3 wide receiver, number 3 running back. So um, target some of those more pressing positions if you're going to try and corner a top player of the market. So fair.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah, you definitely have to look at their overall averages and compare it to, like, if, like you said, that third D tackle, if they're only averaging, maybe 8 points a game, where you know you're getting the same average at probably what your linebacker 20
Right.
or somewhere in,
Exactly.
around there. So there's room to find those better players, for especially the IDP flex, the defensive flex positions, to focus on those roster positions, or those just position groups that have a deeper run of people that you're gonna be able to get a good, you know, what did we say, about 15 average points per game is kind of what we want to be looking at for a given player.
I think when I looked at the numbers here, um, I think 11, 11 and a half points per
11
game
and
is
a half is
kind
the
of
average.
the
Okay.
baseline. If you're going to have players putting up 11 and a half points a game up and down your roster, that got you to right about 205. So
Sure.
Um, and so, yeah, without giving away the payoff, there are positions that we could prioritize that make it easier to hit that 11 and a half. There are some positions that obviously aren't going to make that a very achievable number. So if you're drafting
Right.
those higher, you're maybe shooting yourself in the foot. Yeah, exactly. That was one that I was hoping would be easier to find out. That kind of value based replacement, where if you hit this position at this number, you're better off just moving along to the next position because the value is run out, right? And that's
Right.
maybe everybody can kind of find their own number to go off of. Maybe, maybe there's if someone really wanted to put that work in, that's probably a really good advantage that they could come up
Yeah.
with. But
Right.
you're
Right.
getting my half drunken slacker version of how we get there. So
But I think the key there is, is putting in the work. putting in the work.
Very fair point. Very fair point. Um, let's start on the offense. So, uh, like I mentioned, these are four teams: two that made the playoffs, two that missed the playoffs. Right now, we're going to look at the offensive side. So, just some quick raw numbers. Um, quarterback position: the top 15 averaged to put up about 273 points per game. That's about 18 points per game if you break it down to an individual quarterback. Um, of the top 10 guys, actually, uh, number 10 quarterback put up 269 per game. So he's a little bit below that top 15 average. So to me, that would say that there's a pretty dramatic break off there, probably outside of the top five, where, QBs 6 through 10 are significantly worse than QBs 1 through 5.
Hmm.
I looked at the worst starter. So for our purposes, that would be QB 12 this year, or this upcoming year. So
This
QB
upcoming year.
12 in our league put up 258 and a half. That was about 14 points per game. Uh, but we did draft 17 quarterbacks. So
And that was in
if
a
you
10-team
Yeah,
league.
exactly. So if you think you can just kind of camp on quarterback and one's going to fall into your lap late in the draft, um, that's not a very sound strategy. Case in point, we'll take a look at this first team. Um, he was a playoff winner, a playoff contender. It was Carl.
Hmm. Yep.
Carl actually punted the quarterback position altogether, uh, and the results kind of speak for themselves. Uh, this 4 week span in the season, he actually started a different quarterback every single week. Um, he averaged from that position over 4 weeks 8 points, including a week
Ouch.
with negative 1.8 performance. So now, obviously, when you take a look at the rest of the roster, he made up for those points in other spots. But I feel like if you're able to get a consistent 18 points per game out of that quarterback spot, then you're not needing to sweat the waivers quite as hard going down the line. But
Right.
again, as we look at some of these teams, you can kind of see maybe the merits of playing it differently. So, um, running backs, the top 15 at the running back position. Actually, I looked at the top 30. Wow, I even put a note for myself. How cool am I? Uh, the top 30 running backs averaged 200.8. That's about 14 points per game. The top 10, I guess this would be running back 10, scored
Hmm.
210.35. So that would have been probably about 15 points per game. Um, running back 24, because we start two running backs in the starting slots. Running back 24 was Brian Robinson Jr. He put up 11 points per game on the year. Um, we drafted 61. So we were scraping the bottom of the barrel at running back. And
Yes.
as we look across some of these different starting positions, again, we had some folks maybe struggle a little bit harder. Our second playoff team here is actually you, Ryan. Um,
Yes.
you hit a dry spell at running back here. It looks like you had a
A
three, a
little
six,
bit.
and a three. So, and that was you had Christian McCaffrey was your RB1, and I thought
Yep.
you had a better running back too, but maybe I'm misremembering. Do you remember off
In
the top of your head?
those weeks, I might have been dealing with an injury. Let me see if I can pull it up quick. Like, um, look at my roster those weeks. Give me 1 second. Uh, rosters. Week 7, you said?
Yeah, 7, 8, 9 looks like was a rough patch for you.
Come back to that. Why don't you move on just a little bit, and I'm going to pull that up. I want to see exactly who I was starting those weeks.
For sure. We'll quick zip through the other couple positions. Wide receiver, again, I looked at the top 30. The top 30 average just slightly more than the running back position. Um, your wide receiver 10, again, finished just slightly better than running back 10. Um, the funny thing is, your wide receiver 24 put up almost the exact same number of points as running back 24. That was Jacoby Myers. We did draft 66 wide receivers. So again, hammered that one hard.
Sure.
Tight end, it continues to just be the saddest position in fantasy football. Um, our top 15 tight ends averaged under 8 points per game. Uh, Tight end 10 put up 164. Actually, this was tight end 5, put up 164 and a half. Uh, Tight end 12 would have been Dalton Kincaid, who was averaging less than 7 points per game. Um, this is a little bit of a segue into something I was hoping to discuss a little bit later on, but just to plant the seed now, I think we should look at altering tight end scoring just to give it a slight nudge in the right direction.
Historically, it's always been a controversial position for me. You and I have had many a conversation on that tight end position and what we should do with it. There is a severe drop off between those top three guys. That number three guy, and then even going down to your number four guy, that's a big drop off at that position. And when you get outside of that, you're really scraping the barrel to find somebody that's going to give you that average of, you know, 10 points or so that you're looking to get out of a position on any given week. So what do you have in mind?
What I was thinking, and we looked at a couple of different things and kind of played around with some numbers. If we took away removing the negative quarter of a point for targets, we looked at bumping up points per reception to a higher number. I don't really like either of those. I don't want to juice it so that it's the same as starting another wide receiver. I don't think that's the right
Right.
way to go about it. Um, One option that we have that I actually feel like would work out pretty well is adding a bonus uh, for points per first down. And so
Okay.
my proposal would be adding a half point per first down just for the tight end position. Um, so to give you an example of how that would look, Travis Kelsey finished the season with 166.9. He had 50 first down catches on the season. So that would add 25 points to Travis Kelsey's year end total, putting him at 191 on the year.
Okay. Okay.
Um, so it's a good bump. It's not super overpowered. That still would put Travis Kelsey outside of the top 15 wide receivers. Still valuable, still worth having on your team,
Right.
not not valued the same as like a top 10 wide receiver pick though. Um,
What would that same bump then do to a tight end, let's say David Njoku?
so I didn't look at the exact numbers for a lot of these guys, but um, of the top 12 tight ends, all of them had at least 32 uh, first down receptions.
Okay.
So I think you'd look at, about, depending on the tight end, 16 to 20 points bonus. Kelsey was the big one. Kelsey had 50. He was the only one that hit 50.
Hmm.
Um, I think Hawkinson had like 46. Um, Jake Ferguson had like 40. Dalton Schultz had like 34. So I mean, yeah, like I said, you're looking at probably like 16 to 20 points for
Okay.
any of these wide receivers, you know, that would move their, and that's, the full year, right? So
Tight end. Tight ends.
maybe on a good week you're adding a point and a half, something like that. So
But it still tries to close that gap a little bit between your Travis Kelce's and your Hawkinsons down to your Njoku's, your Ingrams,
right, exactly.
and like I like the proposal. It would be interesting to hear what the rest of you feel about that proposed change. I think there's a good way that we can go about doing that by putting out a league poll for everyone to weigh their opinion. How do you like that? Do you want to see that happen? Do we want to try it, for a season and see what happens? You guys can let us know.
Perfect. We'll throw it up there. I I think we want to get this voted on before the draft, though, obviously,
Yes,
because we don't want to go into the draft expecting one way or another different point scoring for a position, and then have the old rug pulled out from under us. So
right.
we'll give it a couple weeks voting just to make sure everyone's had time to take a look and kick it around, and polls will close probably that week of our draft. We'll go for it. So,
Perfect. Perfect.
okay, awesome. Well, now that I've completely non sequitured us and went the
Yes.
other
Well,
way.
going back to that running back where I went through that dry spell, I thought this was what happened, and I confirmed that. So going, what was that, week 6 where I had 20 some points
Yes.
uh, at that running back too. I was going with Kyron Williams there, who I had picked up in free agency real early on in the season. And then he went through a period where he wasn't playing because he was injured. And so I was, you know, really scraping the barrel. Looks like in week 7, I was playing Devin Singletary, you know, um, just having to put somebody in there. So yeah, I
Right.
did go
Right.
through that dry spell there, where I didn't really have a good option for that running back too.
And that's going to happen, and that's going to happen even after we shrink the rosters down and add more. So, but that's half the fun of fantasy football.
Right.
I hate to say, tough break, but uh, I think we all probably dealt with some injury
Oh yeah.
uh,
Oh yeah.
adversity throughout the course of the year. So, yeah. Um, let's take a quick look at the two non-playoff teams over this same span. So we saw Carl and Ryan up top here. Carl on offense was averaging about 12 points per player. That's including miserable output from his quarterback position, and it looks like the second wide receiver position, only pulling up 7 points per game. Ryan was also doing about 12 points per game. We cleaned out kind of that drought that happened at his RB2 position. It looks like his other flex spot here also had a pretty rough go of it. We're under 7 points there. Um,
Yeah.
over that same time period, Brian is on the right, Brent is on the left. Now, both of these guys ended up missing the playoffs. Brent actually opened up the year really strong. I think the first 5 weeks of the season, he'd gone either 4-1 or 5-0 before this point. Um, and you could see the season definitely turned on him at this point. But
Hmm.
I mean, still, he was averaging 10 points per player on offense here. Had a really good showing. I think his quarterback was Mahomes, so it's something
Yep.
he didn't have to sweat doing 19 points per game there. Um, Wide receiver slipped away from him. I know he had CD Lamb at one point. I think he had a bye week and shuffled him around into like one of the flex spots after that. That must
Sure.
that must be here where he had
Yeah,
34 and a
that's right.
half and then 21 here. So um, he wasn't lacking weapons. He just had maybe a bye week and then, maybe had to juggle some things around there. The one that really surprised me was looking at Brian's team. Now, Brian was the exact opposite of Brent, where I think he opened the season going 0 and 5. And then over this 4 week stretch, he really outperformed a fair margin. He was going over 12 points per game. He was outscoring Carl on the offensive side, outscoring you on the offensive side,
Yes.
um, getting huge numbers from a lot of these guys. Over 19 from the quarterback, over 15 from his running backs. Um, just really doing a hell of a job. One really bad output here, a negative random point score, on a loss that he took. But uh, if he could have kept this pace up, for more than 4 weeks, and I don't know how it looked, after week 9, but um, Brian at one point was definitely charging up the bottom of the rankings and really doing some good stuff there. So it just goes to show you that, yeah, you just have to make plays, make moves, I should say, and hopefully good things follow. And those things were following for Brian at that point in time.
Yes.
Um, Speaking of making moves, before we look at the defensive side, Ryan, I know you did some work here looking at acquisitions throughout the year and even throughout the history
Did.
of the league. Do you want to talk about
I
that a little
did.
bit?
Yeah. So, in preparing for our conversation tonight, I thought it would be interesting to take a look at the playoff teams versus the non-playoff teams, and how many acquisitions and trades that those teams made throughout their seasons, to kind of see if there was any indication here as to why a team might make the playoffs versus a team that might not make the playoffs. And so, just to look at what you got there up on the screen, we'll look at this last season. Our four playoff teams averaged 43 and a half acquisitions throughout the season. So they were on that waiver wire. They were spending their fab bucks. They were going out and getting players to make their team what it was going to be heading in to the finals of the season. Then, if we look over to the next non-playoffs teams, those teams were averaging 23 and a half acquisitions on the year and 1.17 trades on the year. Now, of course, there's some outliers there. You see that one non-playoff team. Ben, I can't quite read it on your screen. Who is that one playoff non-playoff team that had 47 acquisitions?
Very good. Very good. Yes.
um, so there are going to be those outliers where there's going to be some teams that make a lot of acquisitions and don't make the playoffs. They probably just missed the playoffs, and you have some that sneak into the playoffs and didn't make a lot of acquisitions. But what I found is that in each and every year that we've existed, the playoff teams have averaged more acquisitions than the non-playoff teams. Like I said, there's going to be those outliers. There's going to be those times where you make a lot of acquisitions, you're doing a lot, but you don't make the playoffs. There's some times where you don't do a lot and you don't make the playoffs. But what I think this tells us is that you have to be in there making the moves. Obviously, the right moves are kind of key, and that's kind of where some of that luck plays into it. It's like, okay, maybe that one guy that you thought, oh, he's going to have the advantage in this week. I'm going to grab him for whatever reason. It doesn't work out for you. Or another time, you grab a player after week one, and he turns out to be a guy like Devon H. Where he just goes off for weeks on end and has does grand things for your team. But you got to be making the moves. You can't make the right moves if you're not making any moves at all. So pay attention, grind out that waiver wire, take the risk in, spending up on some players that you think might be a league winner for you rest of season, but also not spending your whole wad right off the bat.
Yeah, I think I've more often been let down holding on to a guy and going, okay, well, next week he's going to turn it around, rather than, just pulling the plug and then that's out of sight, out of mind. So sure, maybe I cut, you know, Kayvon Thibodeau and he has a sack and a half next week. Oh, bummer. I'm missing out on 14 points. Well,
Yep.
sure, but was it really worth sitting around the first 3 weeks when he put up a point and a half, 3 points, 1 point, on the hope that he's going to finally break out and have a 14, 15 point game? No, I think you're more often than not, it's going to be out of sight, out of mind if you get that underperforming guy off your team and you just make the move and go on to the next one. Hell, I think I even circled back and picked up Kayvon Thibodeau once or twice after I cut him in the season. He's still going
Right.
to be out there,
Just to see
It's
what happens, you know,
right,
and
exactly.
going through all 3 seasons of data, our playoff teams averaged over 10 more acquisitions than our non-playoff teams. So, I mean, it does act as a pretty decent indicator that if you're putting in the work, you're going to be that much closer to making the playoffs and finding a way to win in the playoffs when you're making those moves.
Well said, sir. Well said. That's actually that's actually pretty wild to see. Uh, Playoff teams making 37.3, non-playoffs making under 25. Even fifth place is right there at 30 points or 30
Yep,
acquisitions. So,
30.3 acquisitions. Those teams that finished in fifth place just missed the
so yeah,
playoffs. So I mean, they're
they're
there.
still
That's
trying. Yep,
yep, they're still there. And
good
now when we
stuff.
move to what, 8 teams, yeah, going to our new playoffs system, those teams are now, the ones that are in that range that are making the moves, they have a better chance of making a run uh in the playoffs.
Yeah, absolutely. I always try and treat the bottom of my bench as, basically just a revolving door.
Yep.
You're getting maybe 2 weeks to show that you've got something there. Otherwise, what's, your bench number 7 guy. What else are you
Yep.
doing for me?
And don't hold on to nostalgia. Just because you drafted a guy, don't be afraid to say, you know what, I may have drafted you, I might have drafted you in the first round, but it's not working. Try to find a trade partner, and if it's really not working, you just got to cut bait.
All right. I'm going to try and speed run through the defensive portion of this one since I know we've gone a bit longer than I had anticipated because I'm a jabberer. So apologies. Um, Defensive side of the ball. We've got the same 4 teams over that same 4 week span. This time we're just going to focus solely on defensive scoring. Um, a quick recap on those positions. Linebacker, the top 20 guys put up over 240 and a half. So again, linebacker is far outperforming D line and defensive backs. Um, your top 10 linebackers, 238. That was Ernest Jones. The worst
Intense.
starter uh, put up 196, so that would have been linebacker 24. So again, right under 200 points for the 24th ranked linebacker. That's wide receiver. That's better than wide receiver and running back. I think they were both
Yep.
175. So um, that's almost 2 points per game better.
Yep.
Um,
Yep.
D line.
And but it's drastic how many less linebackers that were drafted. I mean, we had in the 60s for wide receivers and running backs, and we're starting the same number of wide receivers and running backs as we are linebackers, but we drafted 20 less linebackers.
That's a good point too. Yeah, if
That's
we
that's
yeah,
insane. I mean, that kind of shows you how much more emphasis we need to be putting on paying attention to our defensive players, because these are the players that are really going to be a difference maker.
that's really been a big change in my focus over the last, especially the last year. But just there's a lot of value that you can squeeze out of defense. I
Mhm.
will admit it takes a lot more attention to finding, the matchups and uh, uh, snaps and starter snaps played by different guys in different positions. But that data is all out there. That
Yeah.
data is all free. You just have to
Well,
put in
that
the work.
that's the thing. You
So,
have to you have to be the one putting in the work. There's not a lot of podcasts, articles, and stuff that are talking about these matchups, talking about these guys, which is unfortunate because I think it's a big part of fantasy football that is underutilized in that realm. So yeah, you have to put in a little bit more work yourself instead of relying on the experts giving you those tidbits.
for sure. Let's see. D line fared slightly better than defensive back. Um, our top 10 defensive lineman was Micah Parsons. He had 186. Top 10 defensive back was Derwin James. He had 182. Uh, the worst D lineman, D line 24, he was at 157. DB 24 was at 161. So just a little bit better there. And again, some disparity in those numbers. We drafted 37 D linemen, only 28 DBs. Ryan, I think you accounted for a significant percentage of DBs
I
drafted,
had
right?
four
So,
of those going into the draft,
right, yeah. So,
and
um,
I kept pretty much all of them all season because they were all under contract.
yeah, yeah. And I think you dealt with a lot of injuries with those guys too,
Yeah,
didn't you?
I did.
So,
I did. I did.
all right. Defense is where Carl made hay. I'll dog Carl for his unwillingness to commit to a quarterback. Um, if he wanted to tell me that, yeah, he did that on purpose just so he could draft more defensive guys, I guess good on him because he was averaging over 13 points per game on the defensive side of the ball. I'm
Yeah,
going to say that there was no small amount of luck involved here, though. Um,
right.
I know he picked up Kenny Moore at one point in time. I think it's this 42 and a half point game where Kenny Moore had like two pick sixes in a single game. You can't
Sure.
game plan for something like that. I don't care how
Well,
brilliant of
and
a
even his linebacker in week seven's putting up 41 and a half points. I mean, that's oh, and then a D lineman that same
right.
week putting up 48 points.
Yeah, when you get almost 100 points out of two guys on the defensive side, there's just nothing that your opponent can do. And yeah, you can't game plan for it, but at the same rate, it happened and yeah, good on him, I
Yeah.
guess. So, but yeah, Carl really showing you how it's done on the defensive side. He's
Well,
just
that was the week that his quarterback put up negative 1.8 points.
right.
Um, back
That
to,
is
so I mean,
that
and so
is
that's why he won that week is because he was able to compensate on this defensive side of the ball.
absolutely. We had said 11 and a half points per player was kind of your sweet spot for making the playoffs. Again, Carl outpaced that number by 2 full points, so that's pretty good.
Yeah,
Um, Ryan, you were just under that,
just under.
10.79 here. But again, uh, no slouches really. We've got the D line spot was slightly under.
Yep.
One of the DB spots slightly under that. So again, we talked about injuries, and that's something that we're going to have to game plan for. But again, you were just a little bit under that 11 and a half points. Brian was just right on, just over that 11 and a half points on the defensive side. And again, on the offensive side, he was just over 12. So, yeah, I mean, this 4 week stretch for Brian would have been big business if he could have kept it up or even opened up the season a little bit stronger. So, Brent, on the other hand, a couple points below where he wanted to be. And you could see the streak of red there. That kind of correlates directly to that, I think. So,
Yep.
um, but yeah, uh, what can you say? This you just need to make moves in situations like this. Um, when you're seeing single digit points coming out of the defensive side, these are the guys where you know there are going to be replacement dudes out on the waiver wire.
Yep.
You could tell just by looking at those numbers drafted up at the top. Uh, the waiver wire is flush with defensive players. So if I'm only seeing 3 points, 2 points, see you later. It's time to burn and turn, so they say.
Especially at this point in this season that we're focusing on. I mean, you're in crunch time right here, putting in a string of 4 losses in a row because you're not getting near enough points out of your defensive players when there's plenty of guys out there. You got to put in that work. You got to go find them. Don't let
Hmm.
yourself have 3 weeks in a row where you have under 10 points out of a defensive lineman.
Yeah, yeah. And another thing that I should mention too is this is that stretch of the season where we inevitably run into Mageddon, where 5 or 6 teams are on bye in any given week. Try and sabotage your opponents. Make those moves a week or 2 weeks in advance, where you
Yep.
know the bye week is coming up and you're playing the waiver wire 2 weeks beforehand, just to make sure you're not under the under the nail, under the nail. I don't know, under the thumb, whatever. There's some
Yeah,
expression about
sure.
that. So,
Sure. We'll go with that.
uh, so yeah, that is that's kind of the speed run of roster construction, scoring, how things shake out, or how they shook out this last year. Again, these rosters will shrink by one starting offensive spot and one starting defensive spot.
Mhm.
As a result, I think we can expect the line to move back probably a point per player, I would say. Because what we said, 205 to 190.
190-ish.
So yeah, probably about a point per player. So instead of 11 and a half,
You're
I
looking
would
at
hope
10.
yeah, looking at 10, maybe 10 and a half. It's doable. You could see that it's doable just based by, the numbers that are still sitting around on the waiver wire. Um, Not everybody's going to put up 19, not everyone's going to put up 21 and a half. You just got to make up a little bit of ground in between. So,
Yeah.
yeah,
Maybe
play the
instead of
waiver
taking
wire.
that 3rd quarterback, in the draft, you take another linebacker, you take another defensive lineman instead of, focus on those your bench spots on the positions that you have to start multiple of them. The one position, the positions you start one at, 2 weeks before that person's by, then you go get his replacement, barring any injury or anything like that. Don't need to be sitting on 2 quarterbacks, 3 quarterbacks in on your roster, and having 2 of them sit on your bench, taking up space for a position that you need to only start one.
Yeah, absolutely. I can't help but laugh when I see we drafted 16 tight ends, knowing just how poorly the tight end position scores
Yep.
in general. And we drafted 6 extra. So,
Yeah.
um, anyway, my takeaway from this, yes, start thinking about the positions you need to value higher than others, and also think about voting for enhanced tight end scoring, just to see
Everything.
if we
Yeah.
can't pull that number into the sunlight a little bit. So,
Yes, I agree.
yeah.
I agree.
All right, Ryan. Well, thank you very much for
Well, thank
jumping on
you.
here. Yeah,
I'm glad that you decided to want to be in the presence of greatness tonight.
yeah, I'm just hoping to sponge a little bit off of you if I can. So I
Yeah,
figured
well, if we actually had rings for this league, there's three rings in this little meeting here, so there is that.
heavy is the hands, right? So, all right. Well, we'll catch everybody a little bit later. Draft coming up
Yes.
soon.
Do
Uh,
one more plug for the draft, May 19th in Crookston, Minnesota. I'll be happy to host all of you along with our other Crookston contingent. We look forward to having you here. We've got some fun things planned, and it should be a good time.
awesome. Thank you, Ryan.
You bet.
All right.
Bye bye, everyone.